This. Okay. Yeah. Thanks for the invitation. I'm Angelika Stefan. I'm a PhD student at the University of Amsterdam with EJ Wagenmakers. And today I want to talk about beyond power research design in the Bayesian age. So as most of you probably know, there's a credibility crisis in psychology, but also in other disciplines. Psychology has been accused of being unfalsifiable, uncredible, not replicable, and full of false positive results. Now, we can, of course, ask the question, why did this happen? And there is a multitude of different reasons. So you can blame bad incentives, publication bias in the literature, inadequate statistical training of researchers, a publish or perish culture in academia, overselling of results, which makes it difficult to go back on your findings, and all of this. But today I want to focus on one of these reasons, and that is poor research design. You probably all know what statistical power is. That's Statistics 101 from your introductory statistics classes. So I probably also don't have to explain to you what the problem with low statistical power is. When the statistical power in a study is low, you, by the definition of statistical power, have a low probability of detecting existing effects, by which I mean finding a significant p-value if an effect exists, so if it's non-zero. You also, even without publication bias, have a high false discovery rate in a research field, which means that among all positive findings, so among all significant findings in the literature, the proportion of false positive findings will be comparatively low. And this is because your true positive, you will have comparatively few true positive findings compared to the steady number of false positive findings. And also, you have a low probability of replication. This has been often argued and shown, most recently, I think, very eloquently by Ulrich and Miller well, 2 years ago. So, of course, this is a problem. But there's also another problem with research designs, and that is that people use optional stopping. Optional stopping is a p-hacking strategy where you stop the data collection once you have obtained a significant result. So basically what you do is you collect an initial sample size, compute a p-value, and if that p-value is not significant yet, then you just collect another batch of data, conduct your analysis again, check if the p-value is significant. If not, then collect another batch, and so on, until eventually you find a significant p-value, and then you stop. And optional stopping, of course, this is not good because what does it do? It leads to an inflation of significant results. And as you can see on the left here, the more often you peek at your data and check your p-value, the more likely are you to obtain, in the end, a false positive result. So there's an inflation of significant results if you practice optional stopping. This means that eventually, because if you do this aggressively enough, so if you look after each data point and collect lots and lots of data, you're guaranteed actually to obtain a significant result. Which is great if you want to p-hack, but not great for the validity of the inferences, because essentially frequent inferences become invalid if you do optional stopping. So there's actually, there's a simple solution to all of this. Let's just ban small sample sizes and optional stopping. And actually, this has been done before. So there are lots of journals, or some journals at least, that require you to have a certain minimum sample size per condition, for example, that require you to pre-register your analyses so that you hopefully cannot do optional stopping because you have said before that you would use this specific sample size. But I think, and I agree with all of this, and I think it's a good approach. But I think we also need to ask ourselves, why did this happen? What motivated researchers to use small sample sizes and to practice optional stopping? And if you look at this, I think, let's just for a moment assume that researchers are not these bad, malicious creatures who do a lot of p-hacking and intentionally try and get significant results against better knowledge. I think there are good reasons for why this happened, and that is, for example, that resources are limited, which we all painfully know from research. Research funding is limited. Studies are costly, they're time intensive. So it is actually like a relatively rational decision for researchers to try and be efficient in their research, to try and use sample sizes that are as small as possible. And also, what even is a small sample size? What is a small sample size with respect to power depends on the size of your effect. So if your effect is large, you need fewer participants to detect this effect than if your effect size is small. But who actually knows what their effect size is going to be before they start their research? Not many of us, I guess, because otherwise we wouldn't do the study. We wouldn't run the study if we already knew the results. So what will often happen is that people misestimate the effect size in their study. So they will end up with a sample size that is too small, but they just didn't know any better. So there are good reasons for using small sample sizes, or ending up with small sample sizes, unfortunately. So the real issue is that p-values just don't handle the situation very well, because p-values, if you have a small sample size, then your p-value will be very likely to be non-significant. But if the p-value is non-significant, you don't know what happened. Is this evidence for the null hypothesis? Is this is this a true negative result? Or is it just a result where you say, we don't know, we didn't have enough data? So the p-values cannot distinguish between the evidence of absence and the absence of evidence. Similar with optional stopping. If you think about how we learn new information in our daily lives, or how we decide between alternative options, then we actually often do something like sequential testing. So we often learn about our environment in a sequential manner. Think about how you choose whether you want to buy one smartphone or TV or the other one. How do you approach this? You go online, you go search for information, and you accumulate information about both options. And there's one review saying this one is better. There's one review saying the other one is better. And in the end, you gather as much information as you need to make a decision that you're confident about. And this is sort of how we learn in our daily lives. So why should our research be different from this? Why shouldn't we sequentially accumulate our information? And I think, well, this also plays into the lack of statistics education, but I don't think we can really blame researchers for thinking that their statistical methods would be able to do something like this, that their research methods would be able to mirror this accumulation of evidence with increasing sample size, because there's information in each participant. So with increasing sample size, we acquire more and more information. And I also don't think we cannot really blame them for thinking that it's okay to sample until they have sufficient evidence. Just the issue is that the p-value does not quantify evidence. So this is basically their mistake in thinking, but I don't think it's a particularly bad idea to go about research in a sequential manner. Just again, the problem is in methods, not in thinking. So the real issue is, what we would like to do is to distinguish between evidence of absence and the absence of evidence, to monitor accumulating evidence, and to stop once sufficient evidence has accrued. And luckily, there's a statistical framework where we can do this, and that is the Bayesian statistical framework. And in the following 20 minutes, I think, I'll show you how you can use the Bayesian statistical framework to exactly go about this research process as you would like to do. So one problem we had was that we would like to sequentially update our knowledge. And so the good thing is that in the Bayesian framework, this updating of knowledge is really ingrained into the statistical procedure. So we always start out with some prior beliefs about hypotheses, about parameters, whatever. We can use these prior beliefs to make predictions about our environment. We can compare these predictions with the world, with our data, get evidence about our beliefs, and use this evidence to update our beliefs to arrive at some posterior beliefs that are what we believe like how we should rationally update our beliefs to something after seeing the data. And we can do this over and over and over again. So basically our posterior beliefs can then act as prior beliefs for the next instance of our testing or modeling process. So for example, in Bayesian hypothesis testing, this works as follows. Don't get afraid by the equation. It's not that important. So try and read this slide from right to left. We start with some prior beliefs about hypotheses. Prior beliefs about hypotheses are they're represented in prior model odds. You can think of model odds as betting odds. So you have two models racing against each other, and you assign a certain belief to both of them. So, for example, if you believe 3 times more into your alternative hypothesis than into your null hypothesis before seeing any data, then your prior model odds would be 3 to 1 for the alternative hypothesis. Of course, you can also frame this in probabilities. That's why we have all the p's in this equation. So that's your prior beliefs about the models. And then you update these prior beliefs with evidence from the data. And you do this with a quantity called the Bayes factor. And so the Bayes factor tells you how plausible is it to observe the data that you observed under the alternative hypothesis versus how plausible is it to observe the data that you observed under the null hypothesis. So you use this quantity to update your prior beliefs to posterior beliefs. And the posterior beliefs are again phrased in posterior model odds. So for example, if your prior beliefs were 3 to 1 for the alternative hypothesis, and then your Bayes factor is 1 to 3, like basically 3 for the null, then this equals out again, and in the end you don't know what you're thinking. Could also go the other way, so you can also become more certain, or you can also actually change your beliefs. If you look in the literature, you will rarely find this update of beliefs. Actually, you will mostly find the Bayes factor. Why is that? Because, well, your prior beliefs are your specific subjective prior beliefs. Your posterior beliefs are also then updated, your updated individual beliefs. But the Bayes factor is what we can all agree upon. It's the quantity that tells you how to rationally update your beliefs. So basically, the idea is that everyone can go about and look at the Bayes factor and think about their own prior model odds and update them to posterior model odds after reading the paper. Let's take a closer look at the Bayes factor. The Bayes factor, as I said, is the plausibility of data to have occurred under the alternative hypothesis divided by the plausibility of data to have occurred under the null hypothesis. So, for example, you would interpret a Bayes factor of 3 as the data are 3 times more likely to have occurred under the alternative hypothesis than under the null hypothesis. Yeah, that's actually pretty easy and pretty intuitive, I think. You can also note that this is a ratio. So basically, a Bayes factor of 3 means 3 over 1. So you can also basically turn this around. And if there's evidence for the null hypothesis, so if your data were more likely to have occurred under the null hypothesis, then you would just see a Bayes factor of 1 over 3. So, and in that case, you can still interpret the Bayes factor, and it's just the data are 3 times more likely to have occurred under the not alternative but null hypothesis than under the alternative hypothesis. So the Bayes factor, importantly, can provide evidence for the alternative hypothesis and for the null hypothesis. This is important and pretty cool because this is something the p-value cannot do. But there's another thing, because you can think of the Bayes factor as evidence in your data, so evidence for the alternative hypothesis or evidence for the null hypothesis. And if you look at the Bayes factor, if your data are much more likely under the alternative hypothesis, then you have a very high Bayes factor. Like, for example, a Bayes factor larger than 10 or larger than 100. And that means you have strong evidence for the alternative hypothesis. Your Bayes factor can also be very small, close to 0. So it can be, for example, smaller than 10 or smaller than 100, which you can consider strong evidence for the null hypothesis. So no matter how you define this threshold, so basically I use 10 here as an example, but this is really about what you find convincing. So think about your prior model odds and think about what Bayes factor would be able to convince you of the opposite. That's basically your strong evidence threshold. This can, by the way, also differ for different environments, studies, contexts. Maybe you want to be more sure in something like a clinical setting than in a, I don't know, random social psychology study. I'm allowed to say I'm allowed to say this. I have a master's in social psychology. But there's also this intermediate range here with inconclusive evidence. That's where your Bayes factor is sort of non-convincing. And so you have this this division in 3 parts, which means you can use the Bayes factor to distinguish between the absence of evidence and the evidence of absence. Again, what do we mean here? Absence of evidence means we just don't know. That's the mid-range here. And evidence of absence means we have evidence for the null. That's the red left range. Now, let's go back and see what happens if we have small sample sizes. You might have actually heard people say this, Bayesian statistics is so great for small sample sizes. And I think this is mostly what people talk about. So what happens with small sample sizes is that the Bayes factor is just likely to show inconclusive evidence, to fall into this range of, we don't know, we don't have clear evidence to either direction, it's not convincing. Whereas with large sample sizes, the Bayes factor is just very likely to show conclusive evidence to either direction. I have an example here with n equals 20 and a t-test, where you can see that most, for everyone online, that's the left side, that most Bayes factors just fall within this range of 1/10 and 10, so we wouldn't be able to really make a clear decision, at least. Whereas with n equals 200, we can see that a lot more Bayes factors fall into this decisive area. Now this is great. So we can distinguish between the evidence of absence and the absence of evidence. But this doesn't mean that we should use small sample sizes always, because we still want our results to be convincing, right? We don't want to design a study where everyone says afterwards, well, I still don't know, actually. We want to obtain strong evidence. It would at least be preferable for a study that we are planning. And so there's a method that you can actually use to design your studies such that they are at least very likely to produce compelling evidence, and that is Bayes factor design analysis. Bayes factor design analysis is basically like a power analysis, but just for Bayesian methods. And I'm not going to go into the details because you're going to have a power analysis workshop later on. But so what we do here is basically the same as what you will learn later today. We do a Monte Carlo simulation, which means that we create a large number of data sets under the null hypothesis and under the alternative hypothesis. So we just assume that our model, our null model is correct, and assume that our alternative model is correct, and then create some artificial data sets. And then we apply the Bayesian hypothesis test to each of these data sets. Say we created 1,000 data sets, we apply our Bayesian hypothesis test 1,000 times, end up with 1,000 Bayes factors, and then we can plot the distribution of these Bayes factors and just see how many of these are convincing according to our thresholds that we set. And of course, what you can also see here is we can do this under the null model and under the alternative hypothesis model. So we can also plan for getting compelling evidence for the null hypothesis. And I think this is something that is pretty cool because this is on so many levels something we cannot do with p-values. And in this analysis, basically, if you're not happy with having a large proportion of in-between Bayes factors, like inconclusive evidence, what you can do is just try out what happens with a larger sample size. See what happens if you increase your sample size from 20 to 200. And if you get a result that you would be more happy with. Importantly, this is before you conduct a study. This is also not something you have to conduct. It's just something that helps you to figure out whether your study can provide you with strong evidence or whether you're likely to end up in the inconclusive category. So we covered this one point, evidence of absence and absence of evidence, and how to plan for strong or conclusive evidence. Now, the other two things we wanted to do was to monitor accumulating evidence and stop once sufficient evidence has accrued. And now here's the great thing about the Bayes factor. The Bayes factor is not affected, the interpretation of the Bayes factor is not affected by different stopping rules. So the Bayes factor is immune to optional stopping. So you're actually allowed to do optional stopping with the Bayes factor. And this often feels unintuitive, a little bit wrong, like nasty, something your statistics professor didn't want you to know. And there's actually a very elaborate explanation of this, very nice to read in this paper that I very much recommend if you want to know more about. It's I can give you, I think, an intuition about why the Bayes factor is immune to optional stopping. So think about, I have a random woman, and I want to know, based on her body height, if she's more likely to be German or Dutch, because so Germans are a little bit smaller than German women or than Dutch women. And I want to know for this woman whether she is more likely to come from this distribution or that distribution. Now, this data point, 160 centimeters, 67 centimeters, has a certain plausibility under this distribution and under that distribution. And well, here it's, I think, about the same, but it could be slightly different. But the plausibility, so this, if I take the ratio of these plausibilities, that just shows me how much more plausible is it that this data point came from this distribution than from that distribution. It doesn't really matter when I collected this data point, how I collected this data point, whether I plan to collect this data point, or whether I collected it, whether my friend collected it, whether, I don't know, whatever you can think about the data collection process doesn't really matter, as long as I don't change the value of this woman. Because if I specifically picked a very large woman or something like that, that would be weird. I shouldn't do that. Or I somehow change the populations. So basically, as long as I don't actually change the model that, or the population model that my data came from, the data collection process doesn't matter. And it doesn't matter for this woman. It also doesn't matter for the next woman that I collect. And it also doesn't matter for the next one. Because yeah, it's basically all the same. And the Bayes factor is a sort of extended likelihood ratio where I just look at not only one woman or one data point, but several data points that were either generated under the null hypothesis or under the alternative hypothesis. So I think this gives a bit of an intuition about it. As I said, if you want to read more, you can go to this paper. So now here's what's pretty great about the Bayes factor is that we can actually use the Bayes factor to create a design based on optional stopping. So, and this design is called the sequential Bayes factor design, where we just start sampling with an initial sample and check our Bayes factor. And if that Bayes factor is not convincing yet, we just continue sampling and check the Bayes factor again. Continue sampling, check the Bayes factor again, et cetera, until we are at a threshold where we have sufficient evidence, again, for the alternative hypothesis or for the null hypothesis. So here it's, it just makes sense to have two thresholds, one for the alternative hypothesis, one for the null hypothesis, because you would be convinced by evidence to either side. And this design is pretty cool because it uses resources very efficiently. So we stop exactly at the point where we have sufficient information. It also provides you with strong evidence. So you're guaranteed to end up at your evidence thresholds where you're happy with the amount of evidence that you got. So it guarantees you to obtain strong evidence. It also aligns very well, I think, with this general model of how we update our knowledge about information, about things in our environment. This is a bit of look into the future. It also allows us to combine evidence that accumulated over time. So as long as we think that we really think that the same data generated process underlies our data sets, for example, we can also just use one data set and then the other one and then the next one, and just combine all these data sets in a sequential manner. And compute the updating Bayes factor, for example, from an original study and one replication, the next replication, the next replication, et cetera. All right, I think it's about time. Yeah, I hope that I could show that how you can bring research design into the Bayesian age, how the Bayesian statistics can help you to think in a bit of a different way about your research designs. And